On WNYC. So here's something you may or may not have thought about. The American military and its profound impact on, of all things, modern fashion, our clothing and our accessories. Think about staples like bomber jackets and aviator sunglasses. Hello, Joe Biden. Cargo pants. Not your style? What about a plain cotton T-shirt? Well, apparently, soldiers coming back from World War I made it popular to wear them as regular shirts. Before that, they were considered underwear. Or another World War I staple, the wristwatch. So in a new installment of our popular podcast, Articles of Interest, our next guest argues almost all classic menswear is based on 20th century militaria, and that enduring appeal, we'll see it goes all the way back to the founding of the country, says something deeper about the American psyche and how Americans think about ourselves. So joining us now about the new season on the link between the U.S. military and the clothes we all wear is none other than Avery Trufelman, host of the podcast Articles of Interest. Hey, Avery, welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. It's good to be here.
Before we get into how the military has influenced fashion trends today, you start with a history of the military itself and its relationship to clothing. And you say Americans were always dressing to look more rugged than they were. How far back do you want to go?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny because I feel like there's this thing, people get kind of roasted for dressing more rugged than they are, right? For like wearing these really hardcore raincoats to go walk the dog. And I just think this is like as American as apple pie. I think that, you know, Americans have been dressing like Daniel Boone to go do mundane things since the founding of this country. It's just kind of a part of who we are. And it ties back to American military dress since before the United States had a military. I mean, this is the funny thing about American dress. Our country is so relatively young. It's kind of easy to trace it back. But very long, very interesting story short. The fascinating thing about the United States is initially many of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson included, was like, they were like, oh, this country, maybe we shouldn't have a military. Maybe a military is a bad idea, because they were looking back to the kind of early democracies of antiquity, and oftentimes a standing military, military coups happen all the time. And so they thought maybe we shouldn't have a military, and so we shouldn't have a military uniform. Maybe we should all just wear something called the hunting shirt. And the hunting shirt was this fringy, it's very Daniel Boone looking. It has this fringy outdoorsman looking thing to it. And this is what our militias were supposed to wear. And you were supposed to be able to sort of slide it on over your normal clothes and sort of grab your gun and defend your friends and fellow countrymen. And this was supposed to be the sort of everyman shirt that we were all supposed to wear because we were supposed to be this nation without a military. And then that very quickly didn't work out, because we got our butts sort of kicked kind of immediately and very quickly realized we did need a military, and then we did need a military costume. But it's very interesting, the idea of our clothing and who we are as a nation and our military have always been very, very interwoven. So right away we were like, oh, we're going to be these scrappy, outdoorsmen fighters, not this regimented military, even though that didn't work out.
And so for your first episode in this season of Articles of Interest, you head to the headquarters of the clothing brand Buck Mason to meet with their chief designer, Kyle Fitzgibbons, and he shows you their archival collection that he and his design team use as references. Here's a 20-second clip from the podcast.
If you pick things off of this wall, there's almost every archetype for every modern piece of clothing.
Like what? Like what are we seeing?
I see flight jackets, bomber jackets, 1950s and 60s automotive car culture jackets, every version of a field jacket, chore jackets, it's all there.
I guess my question, Avery, is do people even realize all the time that they're dressing in military gear or clothing as fashion? Even you go back to the 1960s, anti-Vietnam War protesters loved to shop at Army-Navy stores.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think it went in these waves, right? I think the fascinating thing is after World War II, that was the giant surplus boom because everybody thought, the Manhattan Project was obviously a secret. No one knew the atomic bomb was coming. Everybody thought World War II was going to go on for years and years and years and years. So the United States military made so much clothing, and that kind of accounted for why there was so much military surplus. So for decades, people just sort of wore these clothes as basics. They almost forgot that they were military clothes. So I think for a long time, people just sort of forgot that like the pea coat was a military coat, and as you said, the T-shirt was underwear. Everybody sort of forgot for decades until, as you said, the anti-war movement, and then suddenly there was sort of this giant recollection that, oh yes, these were military clothes, and let's sort of reclaim them as military clothes. And now it's sort of this interesting twilight period. You can go to almost any major retailer, Buck Mason included, and they'll have, they're still called field jackets, cargo shorts. They look almost exactly like things you would have been able to buy in a surplus store. And I just don't know if it's registering to people that these are former military surplus clothes. Right. In many cases, almost copied, at least in the case of Buck Mason, stitch for stitch. And I think the big difference is that the military surplus store doesn't exist anymore. And the only place you can buy these clothes is in high fashion stores.
Avery Trufelman is my guest. If you're just joining us, host of the podcast Articles of Interest. Her new season relates how much of modern fashion somehow is related to military wear. And we're going to play another clip here. And it again goes back sort of to the founding era. You spoke to Joshua Kerner, who's actually an attorney, but you say he moonlights as a deep archival research obsessive. And you talk about one of the earliest battles in the Revolutionary War that happened really close by, the Battle of Brooklyn, that was fought near the western edge of Long Island in what is now Brooklyn. Let's listen to about a minute from the podcast. This clip starts with the voice of Army veteran and author Phil Clay and ends with the voice of that Joshua Kerner.
The Hessian mercenaries were professionals at war, and the Americans weren't.
The British had hired German mercenary soldiers, the Hessians, who were ruthless killers for hire.
At the Battle of Brooklyn, Hessian mercenaries whooped the citizen soldiers pretty badly.
There's this big reconsideration. Maybe we couldn't just rely on militias. Maybe we did need to have an actual, regular, professional standing army dressed in something a little bit better than linen smocks. Maybe they should be actual uniforms made of actual sturdy wool. They opted to put soldiers in a British-style uniform. What else did they know? Our colonial button-down regimental coats looked basically identical to the red coats, but ours were blue.
We think of army green now, but it used to be army blue was the color of the military.
There's an interesting fact that most people probably don't know. I didn't know it. We do think of green as sort of the essential military clothing color, but it used to be blue?
Yes, it used to be blue. And, you think about like the Civil War, right? The Union was blue. It was blue for a very long time. And so the interesting thing is, I spent an ungodly amount of time in episode 1 going over how it changed. And it changed in a war that's not often talked about, which is the Spanish-American War, which is the first war that the United States fights abroad. And this is when we shed our signature blue. And it's functionally because it's our first sort of colonial endeavor. And we copy the British. We copy the British khaki that they wore essentially during their colonial campaigns in India, during the Raj. And we kind of never let it go. It's very interesting. We have a long history of copying other countries as we're sort of searching for our identity. And we do it through our military uniforms.
Spanish-American War during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. Here's an interesting question from a listener. Tell me if you think this is accurate or if you came upon this in your research. It says, military fashion fact. women's nylon stockings were invented to replace wool stockings because the military needed all the wool for soldiers' uniforms. Do you know that to be true?
Yes. I've come across this fact a lot. You know, there's like this whole idea that the United States, just the idea that every single facet of every single industry contributed to the war effort in a way that we sort of can't fathom now is another thing that just contributed to almost every single aspect of clothing. I mean, that's the other thing. I feel like I've been researching clothing history for years now, and almost every single thing that I've ever touched on really goes back to usually World War II and sometimes World War I. And it's always stories like this. It's always like something had to be sacrificed for the war effort in this way that we can't fathom now. But yes, I've absolutely come across that fact. And, you know, you also come across this other fact that like oftentimes, to preserve silk, like wedding dresses used to be made out of repurposed old parachutes and like all these interesting fun facts of like ways people used to scrimp and save and preserve in the name of the war effort. I mean, some are quite apocryphal and some aren't. I honestly focus less on the home front and more on like the soldier's perspective on this series. So I'm less in a place to speak to that, but it's really true. This is a huge part of the ways that warfare has affected all of our lives and what we wear to this day.
Here is a comment on a 1960s reference from before. A listener writes, about military surplus clothes during the anti-Vietnam War era, we consciously chose to wear military-style clothes as everyday wear to make a statement. It was definitely not forgetting that this was military gear. And I think that's kind of the point you were making before, right? When I asked the question, that some of that was very conscious to kind of appropriate military gear into civilian life.
Absolutely. I was saying that there was a generation that was kind of before that era that was sort of just wearing it as basics until the 60s came along and really remembered that these were military and were actively, emphasizing that these were military clothes. And then, the funny thing that came after it was this sort of yuppification of military surplus. The 60s kind of made this rebellious look of military surplus so sort of widely accepted that suddenly, you watch Annie Hall and Woody Allen is like waiting to go to the movies in his field jacket. And in Kramer versus Kramer, Dustin Hoffman is like, I forget, he's like a lawyer living, in Manhattan wearing his field jacket. And a lot of this actually has to do with the brand Banana Republic, which began its life as a surplus store. It began selling surplus clothes and kind of zhuzhing them up, making them a little bit nicer, making them a little bit trendier. And there were a lot of stores and boutiques that began their lives like this. It's just that Banana Republic was purchased by Don Fisher, owner of The Gap. But these things became very mainstream, and I think that's part of what allowed clothes like the field jacket and these basics, these things that we consider basics now that so obviously represent military clothes, to enter mainstream fashion now and kind of trickle back down from that spirit of revolution that guided the 60s. So
let's wrap up with this. Although the outdoor industry, hiking, camping, rock climbing, and all the gear that comes with it is a global trend, you can make the argument that it's most visibly popular in the United States. Is this really an American thing, or is this kind of a global thing?
Well, it's definitely a global thing now, but the American outdoor industry has a very specific look. Obviously, there's a huge outdoor industry with a rich history, especially in like alpine countries, like in Europe. But the United States has a rich outdoor history that's very much co-shaped by the military, and that is a huge part of this history and this series. And it's too big a history to go into now, but it's fascinating. But people can listen to your podcast series and learn a lot more. That is Avery Trufelman, host of the podcast Articles of Interest. Her new season called Gear premieres tomorrow.
Avery,
Yeah.
thanks for coming up. By the way, is it true that your parents met a generation ago when they were both WNYC employees?
Yeah, it's true. I think my mom let you take naps in her office, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe when I did those double shifts, the night show after the day show. Avery, thanks for coming on and paying
Thanks
it
so
forward.
much for having me.
Articles of Interest is the podcast. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Amy Sedaris next. Stay with us.